The flames danced higher as my father hurled the carefully wrapped package into the fireplace. 23 years of birthday gifts, Christmas presents, and graduation surprises, all reduced to ash in seconds. But it wasn't the destruction that made my family gasp. It was what spilled out of that burning box that changed everything we thought we knew about our lives forever. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed my father was the cruelest man alive. Growing up in suburban Denver, I watched him destroy every gift I ever tried to give him. Every single one. Without exception. It started when I was 7 years old. I'd spent weeks making him a clay ashtray in art class, even though he didn't smoke. My tiny hands had shaped every curve, and I'd painted "World's Best Dad" in wobbly blue letters across the bottom. When I proudly presented it to him on Father's Day, his face went stone cold. He took one look at my masterpiece, walked straight to the kitchen trash can, and dropped it in without a word. I cried for hours that day, but Mom just rubbed my back and whispered, "Your father shows love differently, sweetheart." The pattern continued relentlessly. At age 10, I saved up my allowance for 3 months to buy him a tie clip with his initials engraved on it. He opened the small velvet box, examined the silver piece for exactly 2 seconds, then placed it back in the box and handed it to my mother. "Return this tomorrow," he said simply, then walked away. For my 13th birthday, I decided to make him a photo album filled with pictures of our family trips, school events, and random moments I'd captured with my disposable camera. I spent weeks organizing the photos chronologically, writing little captions underneath each one. Dad teaching me to ride a bike. First day of middle school. Dad and me at the state fair. I was so proud of the finished product. When I gave it to him that Christmas morning, he flipped through exactly 3 pages before closing it firmly. He stood up from his chair, walked to the fireplace where a fire was already crackling, and tossed the entire album into the flames. I watched months of work disappear in seconds, the plastic photo sleeves curling and melting, my careful handwriting turning to smoke. "Robert!" my mother gasped, but he was already heading upstairs. That was the first time I saw something burn. Hi. School brought more of the same torture. A handmade wooden pen holder in shop class, thrown away before I even finished explaining what it was. A framed certificate from when I won the regional spelling bee with his name listed as proud parent. He tore it in half right in front of me. A coffee mug with our family photo printed on it that I'd ordered from a catalog with my part-time job money. He accidentally dropped it on the kitchen floor, watching it shatter into dozens of pieces. My younger brother Marcus tried to defend me once. "Why can't you just say thank you?" he demanded after Dad had coldly rejected my attempt to give him a tie for his birthday. "Rebecca works hard on these things." Dad's response was swift and final. "She needs to learn that not everyone wants her gifts." The words hit like physical blows. I was 16 then, old enough to understand that something was fundamentally broken in our relationship, but too young to know how to fix it. College provided some relief from the constant rejection. I studied journalism at the University of Colorado, threw myself into campus activities, and tried to forget about the father who couldn't accept a single gesture of love from his eldest daughter. But every holiday break brought fresh reminders. I'd arrive home with carefully chosen presents, books I thought he'd enjoy, nice bottles of wine, tickets to sports games, and watch them all get dismissed with the same cold efficiency. My mother, Patricia, developed an elaborate system. To protect my feelings, she'd intercept my gifts and hide them, then return them to stores or give them to neighbors, telling me later that Dad had really appreciated the thought, but wanted to save them for a special occasion. I pretended to believe her lies because the truth was too painful to acknowledge. Marcus, meanwhile, received enthusiastic reactions to his gifts. Dad would beam with genuine joy when Marcus brought him homemade cards, small trinkets from school trips, or even just interesting rocks he'd found in the yard. He'd display Marcus's artwork on his office walls and brag about his son's creativity to anyone who would listen. The difference in treatment was so stark it felt deliberate, like a carefully orchestrated campaign to show me exactly where I stood in his affections. By the time I graduated college, I'd stopped trying. What was the point of setting myself up for rejection over and over again? I moved to Chicago, got a job at a local newspaper, and built a life that didn't revolve around seeking approval from a man who clearly couldn't stand me. But distance didn't kill hope entirely. Every year on his birthday, Father's Day, and Christmas, I'd find myself standing in stores, holding potential gifts, and wondering if this time might be different. Maybe a nice watch? A book about Colorado history that I knew interested him? A gift card so he could choose something himself. Each time, common sense would eventually win out. I'd put the item back on the shelf and walk away empty-handed, knowing that any gesture would only result in more pain. This went on for 5 years. 5 years of holidays where I showed up with nothing, enduring my mother's disappointed looks and Marcus's gentle suggestions that I should just try one more time. 5 years of watching other family members exchange thoughtful presents while I sat empty-handed, the daughter who'd given up on giving. Then came this past Christmas. I'd been promoted to senior reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and I was feeling confident and successful for the first time in years. Maybe it was the professional validation, or maybe I was just tired of being the only person in our family who didn't participate in gift exchanges, but something inside me decided to try one final time. I spent weeks planning the perfect gift. Not something handmade that he could dismiss as childish, not something expensive that might make him uncomfortable, but something meaningful and practical. I researched his interests, thought about his hobbies, and finally settled on a beautiful, leather-bound journal with his initials embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, I wrote a simple inscription: "For all your thoughts and stories, love, Rebecca." It was elegant, useful, and personal without being overly sentimental. I was sure he couldn't find fault with it. I flew home to Denver 3 days before Christmas, the wrapped journal carefully packed in my carry-on bag. I'd even splurged on expensive wrapping paper and a silk ribbon, wanting everything to be perfect. Christmas morning arrived with the usual flurry of activity. Mom made her famous cinnamon rolls. Marcus and his new girlfriend Sarah helped set the table, and Dad sat in his favorite armchair reading the morning paper while Christmas music played softly in the background. It felt normal, peaceful even. We opened presents in order of age, starting with the youngest. Sarah went first, then Marcus, then Mom, then me. I received lovely gifts from everyone: a cashmere scarf from my parents, a cookbook from Marcus, perfume from Sarah. Everyone seemed genuinely happy with their presents. The mood was warm and celebratory. Finally, it was Dad's turn. Marcus handed him a fishing tackle organizer that earned genuine praise and an actual hug. Mom gave him a new winter coat that he immediately tried on, modeling it for all of us with a rare smile. Sarah had contributed to a gift card for his favorite restaurant, which he tucked into his wallet with thanks. Then all eyes turned to me. I could feel my heart hammering as I retrieved the journal from under the tree. My hands were actually shaking as I held it out to him. "Merry Christmas, Dad." He took the package from my hands, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope. He held it carefully, testing its weight. He untied the ribbon slowly, almost reverently. He peeled back the wrapping paper with unusual care. When he opened the box and saw the journal, his face went completely blank. He lifted it out, ran his fingers over the leather cover, opened it to see my inscription. He read the words silently, his expression unreadable. The room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting for his reaction. Even the Christmas music seemed to have stopped. He closed the journal, placed it back in the box, and stood up. Without a word, he walked to the fireplace. The fire crackled as Dad approached the hearth, my journal clutched in his hands. I felt the familiar crushing weight of rejection settling over me, heavier this time because I'd allowed myself to hope after 5 years of giving up. "Robert." "No," Mom whispered. But her voice lacked conviction. She'd watched this scene play out too many times before. He stopped directly in front of the flames, holding the leather journal at chest level. For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, staring into the fire. The orange light flickered across his face, highlighting lines I'd never noticed before. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles working underneath his skin. Then something unexpected happened. His shoulders began to shake. At first, I thought he was angry. That familiar rage that seemed to overtake him whenever I tried to show affection. But as the shaking intensified, I realized something else was happening. My father, the stoic man who never showed emotion, who hadn't cried at his own mother's funeral, was breaking down. A sob escaped his throat, raw and painful. The journal slipped from his grasp and hit the stone hearth with a soft thud. He pressed both palms against the mantelpiece and let out a sound I'd never heard from him before. Pure, unfiltered anguish. "Dad?" Marcus stood up from the couch, alarm clear in his voice. Mom rushed to Dad's side, placing her hand on his back. "Robert? What's wrong? What's happening?" He couldn't speak. The sobs were coming faster now, his whole body convulsing with each one. I'd never seen him like this, vulnerable, broken, human. It was terrifying and heartbreaking all at once. Sarah grabbed Marcus's hand, both of them looking as confused and frightened as I felt. None of us knew what to do with this version of my father. "I can't," he finally managed to gasp out between sobs. "I can't keep doing this to her." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Mom's face went pale. "Robert, don't. She deserves to know." He spun around to face us, his eyes red and streaming with tears. "God help me, Patricia. She deserves to know the truth." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Dad walked unsteadily to his armchair and collapsed into it, covering his face with his hands. When he finally looked up, his gaze landed directly on me. "Rebecca," he said, his voice hoarse and broken, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 20 years ago." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Marcus and Sarah had moved closer together on the couch, holding hands like they were bracing for impact. Mom stood, frozen by the fireplace, her face a mask of terror. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. Dad took a shuddering breath and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Every gift you've ever given me, every single one, I kept them all." The words didn't make sense. I'd watched him throw away the ashtray, seen him toss the photo album into the fire, witnessed him break the coffee mug on the kitchen floor. "That's not true," I said firmly. "I saw you destroy them." "No, sweetheart." His voice cracked on the endearment, a word I couldn't remember him ever using for me. "You saw me destroy copies." The world tilted sideways. "What?" Mom's legs seemed to give out. She sank onto the ottoman, her face buried in her hands. "Your mother helped me," Dad continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam had burst. "Every gift you made, every present you bought, we'd secretly make copies or buy duplicates. You'd see me destroy the fake ones, and I'd keep the real ones hidden away." I felt like I was drowning. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm a coward." he said simply. Because I was so afraid of loving you too much that I thought pushing you away would somehow protect us both. Marcus leaned forward, his face twisted with confusion. Dad, that doesn't make any sense. It does if you knew my father. Dad's voice turned bitter. Your grandfather, kids. The man you never got to meet because he died when Rebecca was a baby. I vaguely remembered Mom mentioning my paternal grandfather, but Dad never talked about him. Ever. It was one of those family subjects that lived in the shadows, too painful to bring into the light. He was difficult, Dad continued. Controlling, manipulative, cruel when he wanted to be. He had this way of using love as a weapon, giving it when you pleased him, taking it away when you didn't. And his favorite target was always his firstborn child. The pieces began clicking into place with horrible clarity. Me, Dad whispered. I was his firstborn, just like you're mine. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Marcus sat back heavily, understanding dawning on his face. He'd lavish me with attention and gifts when I did what he wanted, then turn ice cold when I disappointed him. The emotional whiplash was devastating. I never knew if I was loved or hated from one day to the next. It messed me up in ways I'm still discovering. Dad stood up and began pacing, unable to sit still as the words poured out of him. When you were born, Rebecca, you were so perfect, so beautiful and bright and full of love, and I was terrified. Absolutely terrified that I would do to you what he did to me. That I'd use your love against you, manipulate you with it, hurt you with it. My throat was closing up. I could barely breathe. So I decided to do the opposite. I thought if I rejected your gifts, if I kept you at arm's length, you'd be safe from me. You'd never have to wonder if my love was conditional, because you'd never have to depend on it in the first place. Robert, Mom said quietly. Tell her about the room. What room? I managed to ask. Dad looked at Mom helplessly, then back at me. Come with me. He led us upstairs, past the bedrooms I'd known my whole life, to a door at the end of the hallway that had always been locked. I'd assumed it was storage, maybe old furniture or holiday decorations. Dad pulled a key from his pocket with trembling hands. The lock clicked open. He pushed the door wide, and I stepped into another world. The small room was like a shrine dedicated to me. Every wall was covered with my artwork from elementary school, perfectly preserved behind glass frames. The clay, ashtray I'd made at age 7, sat prominently on a wooden shelf, polished and gleaming. The photo album I'd watched burn in the fireplace was displayed open on a reading stand, showing the page with my father and me at the state fair. But that wasn't all. There were dozens of other items I'd never seen before. Report cards, school, programs, newspaper clippings of my college achievements, even a printout of my recent promotion announcement that must have been pulled from the Tribune's website. The wooden pen holder from shop class held a collection of pens he'd apparently never used. The torn spelling bee certificate had been carefully taped back together and framed. Even pieces of the broken coffee mug had been glued back together, the cracks visible but somehow beautiful, like Japanese kintsugi. On the far wall hung every school photo I'd ever taken, arranged chronologically from kindergarten through my college graduation. Below them, in a place of honor, sat the tie clip I'd bought him when I was 10, the one I thought had been returned to the store. In the center of the room stood a comfortable reading chair with a small side table. On the table lay an open journal filled with pages and pages of handwriting I recognized as Dad's. I come here every night, he whispered from behind me. I sit in that chair and write you letters I never send. I tell you about my day, about how proud I am of your achievements, about how sorry I am for the way I've treated you. I walked over to the journal with wooden legs and read the open page. December 20th. Rebecca called today to say she's coming home for Christmas. Patricia thinks she might bring a gift this year after all these years of giving up on me. I hope she does. I hope I finally have the courage to accept it properly. I don't know how much longer I can keep breaking her heart. To protect my own. The room started spinning. Marcus caught my arm as I swayed on my feet. 23 years, Dad said, his voice barely audible. 23 years of your beautiful gifts, all safe here, treasured and protected. And 23 years of you thinking I didn't love you. I turned to face him, tears streaming down my cheeks. Why now? Why tell me this now? Because, he said, picking up the leather journal from where it had fallen by the fireplace. This inscription broke something inside me. For all your thoughts and stories. You want to know my thoughts and stories, sweetheart? They're all about you. They've always been about you. He held the journal against his chest like it was precious cargo. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep hurting you to protect myself from a ghost. My father is dead, and I've let his damage poison the most important relationship in my life. The weight of 23 years of misunderstanding crashed down on me. All those moments of rejection, of feeling unloved and unwanted, they'd been elaborate performances designed to keep me safe from a danger that existed only in his traumatized mind. I forgive you, I whispered, because it was the only thing I could think to say. No, he said firmly. You haven't forgiven me yet. Not until you understand what this cost us both. Not until you see how much damage I've done. He was right. Forgiveness would come later, after we'd unpacked decades of hurt and misunderstanding. But for now, for the first time in my life, I finally understood why my father had seemed incapable of accepting my love. He'd been trying to save me from himself, never realizing that his protection was the very thing destroying us both. The silence that followed Dad's revelation stretched on for what felt like hours. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway of the secret room, his girlfriend Sarah pressed against his side, both of them staring at the shrine my father had built to honor the daughter he'd spent decades rejecting. Mom sat heavily in Dad's reading chair, running her fingers over the open journal. Pages filled with 23 years of unspoken love letters to me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The emotional whiplash was too severe. From a lifetime of believing I was unloved to discovering I'd been treasured all along, just in the most twisted, heartbreaking way imaginable. Rebecca, Dad said softly, still clutching my Christmas journal. Say something, please. But what was there to say? That I understood? I didn't. That it was okay? It wasn't. That we could just move forward like nothing had happened? Impossible. Instead, I walked to the shelf where my clay ashtray sat in pristine condition. I picked it up with trembling hands, remembering the 7-year-old girl who had molded it with such hope and excitement. The world's best dad inscription was still perfectly legible, the blue paint as vibrant as the day I'd applied it. You polished it, I whispered. Every week for 16 years, he admitted. It was the first gift you ever gave me. I couldn't let it collect dust. The weight of his obsessive care hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been nursing wounds from his perceived cruelty, he'd been lovingly maintaining a museum of our relationship in secret. This is insane, Marcus finally spoke up. Dad, this is absolutely insane. Do you understand what you've done to her? What have you done to all of us? Dad flinched at his son's harsh tone, but didn't defend himself. Yes. No, I don't think... You do, Marcus continued, his voice rising. I've watched Rebecca blame herself for years. I've listened to her wonder what was wrong with her, why she wasn't good enough for her own father's love. And you were up here every night writing love letters? How is that not completely sick? Marcus, Mom said weakly, but he wasn't finished. And, Mom, you knew about this. You helped him torture her? The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I watched my mother's face crumble as she realized how her complicity had enabled years of my suffering. I thought I was protecting both of them, she whispered. Your father was so broken after your grandfather died. The stories he told me about his childhood. I thought keeping you children safe from that damage was worth any price. Even destroying Rebecca's self-worth? Marcus demanded. We didn't know it would go on this long, Mom said desperately. Robert kept saying he'd find the courage to tell her, that he'd figure out how to show love without the fear. But every year that passed made it harder. Every gift she brought made him more terrified of his own feelings. I set the ashtray down, carefully, and turned to face my family. They were all looking at me with varying expressions of guilt, fear, and desperate hope for forgiveness I wasn't sure I could give. I need to get out of here, I said quietly. Rebecca, wait. Dad started. Toward me, no. I held up my hand to stop him. I can't process this with all of you staring at me. I need space. I pushed past Marcus and Sarah, down the stairs, and out the front door into the crisp December air. My rental car was parked in the driveway, and I sat behind the wheel for several minutes, just breathing and trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Where did you go? Mom's hysterical and Dad's locked himself in the bathroom. I typed back, give me an hour. I'll come back. I drove aimlessly through the Denver suburbs, past houses decorated with Christmas lights and families I imagined were having normal holiday celebrations. Families where fathers accepted gifts from their daughters without elaborate psychological warfare. Eventually, I found myself at Washington Park, where Dad used to take me fishing when I was small. It was one of the few purely positive memories I had with him. Standing at the edge of the pond, learning to cast a line, sharing quiet moments without the weight of gift-giving expectations between us. I sat on a bench overlooking the water and tried to separate my emotions into manageable pieces. Anger at the deception, grief for the relationship we'd lost, confusion about how to move forward. But underneath all of that was something I hadn't expected. Relief. For 23 years, I'd carried the weight of believing I was fundamentally unlovable to my own father. That burden had shaped every relationship in my life, every career, decision, every moment of self-doubt. Learning that the rejection was performance rather than truth didn't erase the damage, but it did remove the core belief that something was wrong with me. My phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately played the message. Rebecca, it's Dad. I know you need space, and I respect that. But I want you to know, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to understand or accept what I did. I just need you to know that every single day for the past 23 years, I have loved you more than my own life. I was just too damaged and too afraid to show it properly. That's on me, not on you. Never on you. His voice broke at the end, and I heard Mom crying in the background before the message ended. I sat in the cold for another 30 minutes, watching the sun set over the mountains and thinking about the impossible complexity of family love. How it could be genuine and destructive at the same time. How good intentions could create devastating consequences. How trauma could echo through generations in the most unexpected ways. When I finally drove back to the house, I found the family exactly where Marcus had described them. Mom was pacing the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. Marcus and Sarah were huddled together on the couch, whispering urgently. And Dad was nowhere to be seen. Where is he? I asked. Still in the bathroom, Marcus said. He won't come out. Says he's too ashamed to face you. I walked upstairs and knocked gently on the bathroom door. Dad? It's me. Go away, sweetheart. Please. I'm not going anywhere until you come out and talk to me. I can't. I can't look at you knowing what I've done. I pressed my forehead against the door. Do you want to know what I've been thinking about for the past hour? Silence. I've been thinking about fishing trips to Washington Park when I was little. Do you remember those? A long pause, then. Yes. Those are some of my happiest memories with you. Not because you said much, you never were much of a talker, but because you were just present. No walls, no fear, no performance. Just you and me and the water. I heard movement inside the bathroom, but the door stayed locked. I've been wondering, I continued, if maybe that's who you really are. Not the man who rejected my gifts and not the man who hoarded them in secret. Just the father who taught his daughter to cast a fishing line and told her she was doing great even when the hook got tangled in the trees. More movement, closer to the door this time. I'm not saying I'm okay with what happened. I'm not saying it didn't hurt me, or that we can just pretend it never occurred. But I am saying that I want to try to find our way back to those fishing trip moments. The real ones, where we don't have to protect each other from imaginary dangers. The lock clicked, and the door opened slowly. Dad stood there looking older than I'd ever seen him, his face haggard and eyes red from crying. "I don't know how to do that," he whispered. "I don't know how to love you without fear." "Then we'll figure it out together," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. But Dad? No more secrets. No more protecting me from things. That might hurt me. I'm 30 years old. I get to decide what risks are worth taking. He nodded slowly, then did something he'd never done before in my entire life. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in a real, genuine, unguarded hug. It should have felt triumphant, like the happy ending to a lifetime of pain. Instead, it felt fragile and tentative, like the first step in a very long journey toward healing. Over his shoulder, I could see into the secret room where my preserved childhood sat waiting. Tomorrow, we'd need to talk about what to do with all those hidden treasures. We'd need to discuss therapy, boundaries, and how to rebuild trust after decades of deception. But for now, I just held my broken father and let myself feel something I'd never allowed before. Hope that we might eventually learn to love each other without fear. 3 months after Christmas, I sat across from Dr. Elena Vasquez in her cozy Chicago office, trying to explain why I felt guilty about my father's progress in therapy. "He's doing everything right," I said, fidgeting with the tissue in my hands. "Weekly sessions with you, daily check-ins with me. He even started reading books about generational trauma. But I keep waiting for him to slip back into old patterns, Dr. Mate." Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. "Recovery from decades of learned behavior doesn't happen overnight, Rebecca. It sounds like you're protecting yourself from disappointment." She was right, of course. Dad had thrown himself into healing with the same obsessive dedication he'd once applied to maintaining my secret room. But trusting his transformation felt like stepping onto ice that might crack at any moment. The first breakthrough had come in January, when he'd called me completely unprompted. "I was in the grocery store," he'd said without preamble, "and I saw a woman yelling at her daughter for dropping a jar of pickles. The little girl was maybe 6 years old and she looked so ashamed. I wanted to tell that mother that mistakes aren't character flaws, that children deserve patience. But then I realized I never gave you that patience." The conversation lasted 2 hours. He told me about specific moments from my childhood that he regretted, apologies for reactions I'd forgotten, but he'd apparently been carrying like stones for decades. It was the longest we'd ever talked, and the first time he'd initiated contact, just to connect with me. February brought even bigger changes. Dad had surprised everyone by suggesting we clear out the secret room together during my next visit to Denver. "It's not healthy," he'd said during one of our weekly video calls. "Keeping your childhood locked away like a museum exhibit. Those things should be integrated into our real life, not hidden away like guilty secrets." The day we tackled the room was emotionally exhausting, but oddly liberating. We went through each item, with Dad sharing the stories behind why he'd saved them, and how he'd felt during the original moments when I'd tried to give them to him. The clay ashtray got a place of honor on his office desk. The photo album moved to the living room coffee table where guests could actually see it. My childhood artwork was distributed throughout the house, finally displayed like normal parents display their children's creations. But the most surprising discovery had been the letters. Hidden behind my school photos, Dad had kept every piece of correspondence I'd ever sent. Birthday cards, thank you notes, even grocery lists I'd written when running errands for Mom as a teenager. He'd arranged them chronologically and reread them so often that the paper was soft and worn from handling. "I memorized your handwriting," he'd admitted, carefully placing a Father's Day card I'd made at age 9 into a new photo album we were creating together. "I could tell when you were happy or sad just by how you formed your letters. When you were excited, your writing got bigger and messier. When you were hurt, it got small and careful." The revelation that he'd been studying me so closely all those years, that he'd cared enough to decode my emotional states through penmanship, had broken something loose inside my chest. For the first time, I truly understood the depth of his love and the magnitude of his fear. March brought the most challenging test yet: my birthday. For 30 years, birthdays had been awkward affairs where Dad would either disappear entirely or sit through celebrations with obvious discomfort. This year, he'd called 2 weeks ahead to ask what I wanted to do. "I know I don't have the right to ask for a celebration," he'd said carefully. "But if you're willing, I'd like to do something special for your 31st. Something that acknowledges all the birthdays I handled wrong." We'd settled on a small dinner at my favorite restaurant in Denver, just the immediate family. When I arrived, I found Dad waiting outside the restaurant entrance, holding a wrapped package and looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. "I bought you a gift," he announced, then immediately looked stricken. "I mean, I know that's not how this works. I know I'm supposed to let you give me things, not the other way around. But I saw this and I couldn't stop thinking about you and—" "Dad," I interrupted gently. "It's okay to give me presents. That's what normal families do." The gift was a professional-grade camera, not expensive enough to feel like overcompensation, but thoughtful enough to show he'd been paying attention to my recent interest in photography. Inside the box was a note written in his familiar handwriting, for capturing new memories to add to all the old ones I finally get to share. "Love, your father who is learning to love out loud." Dinner had been the most relaxed evening we'd ever spent together as adults. Dad asked genuine questions about my work, shared stories from his own childhood I'd never heard, and even laughed at Marcus's terrible jokes. When the waiter brought out the birthday cake, Dad didn't disappear or look uncomfortable. He sang, along with everyone else, off-key but enthusiastic. But it was the small moment after dinner that really showed me how much had changed. As we walked to our cars, Dad had casually reached over and adjusted my scarf, which had gotten twisted in the restaurant. "It's cold tonight," he'd said simply. "Don't want you getting sick." It was such a normal parental gesture, the kind of unconscious care I'd watched him show Marcus countless times, but never experienced myself. The casualness of it, the lack of fear or overthinking, felt like the most precious gift he could have given me. Now, sitting in Dr. Vasquez's office, I was struggling to articulate why these positive changes felt almost as overwhelming as the original revelation had been. "I spent so long adapting to being unloved by him," I explained. "I built my entire identity around being the daughter who wasn't good enough. Now I have to figure out who I am when that story isn't true anymore." "That's profound insight, Dr. Vasquez said. "Tell me more about this identity shift." The truth was, learning about Dad's secret love had forced me to re-examine every relationship in my life. How many friends had I kept at arm's length because I'd learned that love was dangerous and unpredictable? How many romantic relationships had I sabotaged because deep down I believed I was unlovable? How many opportunities had I passed up because I didn't think I deserved good things? My promotion at the Tribune suddenly made more sense. I'd been so shocked by the recognition that I'd almost turned it down, convinced they'd made a mistake. The pattern repeated throughout my adult life. Achievements dismissed, compliments deflected, love offered by others met with suspicion and disbelief. "I'm angry about that too," I admitted to Dr. Vasquez. Not just about losing 30 years with Dad, but about losing 30 years with myself. Who might I have become if I'd grown up believing I was worthy of love? She leaned forward slightly. And who might you become now that you know the truth? That was the question I'd been avoiding, because the answer felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. For the first time in my life, I had the opportunity to make choices based on self-worth rather than self-doubt. I could pursue relationships without the constant fear of rejection. I could take professional risks without the voice in my head insisting I didn't deserve success. The week before, I'd done something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I'd submitted an application for a foreign correspondent position with the Tribune. The role would take me to their London bureau, covering international stories I'd only dreamed of reporting on. Old Rebecca would have talked herself out of even applying. New Rebecca, the one who was slowly accepting that she'd been loved all along, even when it didn't feel like it, had crafted a compelling application letter and sent it off before she could second-guess herself. My editor called yesterday. I told Dr. Vasquez, "I got the job. I will start in London this summer." "How do you feel about that?" "Terrified," I said honestly. "But excited, terrified, not paralyzed, terrified. Does that make sense?" She smiled. "Perfect sense. And how does your father feel about this opportunity?" That conversation surprised me too. When I'd called to tell Dad about the job offer, bracing myself for his concerns about distance and safety, he'd reacted with pure enthusiasm. "London!" he exclaimed. "Rebecca, that's incredible. You've wanted to cover international stories since college. I'm so proud of you." Then, after a pause, "I'm going to miss you terribly, but I'm not going to let my fear hold you back anymore. That's my old pattern, not who I want to be now." We'd talked for an hour about the logistics of the move, the apartment I'd found in Bloomsbury, the stories I was hoping to cover. For the first time in our relationship, Dad was actively encouraging me to chase my dreams rather than subtly undermining them with worry and doubt. As our session wound down, Dr. Vasquez asked her usual closing question. "What feels most important for you to focus on this week?" I thought about the journal Dad had given me, not the leather one from Christmas that had started this whole revelation, but a new one he'd bought specifically for my London adventure. The inscription read simply, "For new stories and new adventures. Love, Dad." "Integration," I said finally. "I want to start living like someone who deserves good things. Not just believing it intellectually, but feeling it in my bones." Walking out of Dr. Vasquez's office into the Chicago spring afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in months. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Saw a story in the paper about London coffee shops. Saving it for you. Call when you have time. No pressure." 3. Casual normalcy of it, a father sharing something interesting with his daughter, without agenda or fear, still felt miraculous. But it was starting to feel sustainable too, like something we could build on rather than a fragile exception to our usual dysfunction. That evening, I called him back. We talked about coffee shops and British journalism and the weather in Denver. Normal conversation between a father and daughter who were finally learning to love each other without fear. For the first time in my life, it felt like enough. 6 months into my London assignment, I was covering a story about refugee families, when I received a call that would test everything Dad and I had rebuilt. "Rebecca, you need to come home." Marcus's voice was tight with panic. "Dad had a heart attack. He's in surgery now." The flight from Heathrow to Denver felt endless. I stared out the airplane window at the Atlantic Ocean below, wrestling with fears I hadn't expected. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified of losing him before we could fix our relationship. Now I was terrified of losing him just when we'd finally found each other. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 30 years of believing Dad didn't love me, the thought of losing him was unbearable precisely because I now knew how much he did. Marcus. met me at the airport, his face drawn and exhausted. "He's stable," were the first words out of his mouth. "Surgery went well. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery, but it was touch and go for a while." In the hospital waiting room, I found Mom curled up in an uncomfortable chair, still wearing the paint-stained clothes she'd had on when the ambulance arrived. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hand and speaking in soothing whispers. "How long has he been out of surgery?" I asked, settling into the chair next to Mom. 3 hours, she said without looking up. "They said we can see him soon, but he's still unconscious from the anesthesia." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of almost losing him settling over all of us. Finally, Mom spoke again. "He was working in the garden when it happened," she said quietly. "Planting those daffodils you mentioned loving in your last phone call. He wanted them to be blooming when you came home for your birthday next month." The detail hit me like a physical blow. Even facing a major health scare, Dad had been thinking about making me happy. The man who once couldn't accept my gifts was now planning surprise gardens based on casual comments I'd made during overseas phone calls. When we were finally allowed into his room, Dad looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Machines beeped steadily around his bed, and his usually robust complexion was pale and waxy. But his eyes were open, and when he saw me, his face lit up with the genuine joy I was still getting used to. "You came," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "From the breathing tube. Of course I came." I took his hand, careful to avoid the IV lines. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he admitted, then managed a weak smile. "But better now that you're here. How was the flight? Did you have to cancel any important interviews?" Even from a hospital bed, recovering from major surgery, he was more interested in my life than his own medical situation. The transformation from the self-absorbed man I'd grown up with was so complete it sometimes still shocked me. "My work can wait," I said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere until you're back on your feet." Over the next few days, as Dad's condition improved and he was moved from intensive care to a regular room, something unexpected happened. The crisis seemed to unlock a level of emotional openness in our family that we'd never experienced before. Maybe it was the reality of almost losing him, or maybe it was the artificial intimacy of the hospital environment, but conversations that would have been impossible 6 months ago began flowing naturally. Dad told us about the moments during his heart attack when he thought he might die. "All I could think about," he said, "was whether I'd done enough to repair the damage I caused. Whether you kids knew how much I love you, not just in secret, but out loud." Marcus, who had been carrying his own anger about our father's deception, finally broke down and admitted how confused and hurt he'd been by the revelation about the secret room. "I kept wondering if your love for me was real," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. "Or if you were just using me to hurt Rebecca, somehow." I know that sounds crazy, but finding out that everything I thought I knew about our family was wrong, it messed with my head. Dad's eyes filled with tears. "Your love was always real, son. You were never part of any game. You were just easier for me to love because I didn't see myself in you the way I did in Rebecca. You reminded me of your mother, open, trusting, uncomplicated. Rebecca reminded me of me, and I was terrified of that." These were the kinds of conversations we'd never had as a family. Raw, honest discussions about feelings and fears, and the complicated dynamics that shape how we treat each other. The hospital setting somehow made it feel safer to be vulnerable. On the 4th day, when Dad was strong enough to sit up and eat solid food, he asked me about a story that had been bothering him. "I've been thinking about that refugee family you were interviewing when you got the call about me," he said. "Did you ever finish that piece?" I was surprised he remembered the detail from Marcus's panicked phone call. "Actually, I did. I filed it remotely from the hotel the night before I flew back. It's running in tomorrow's edition." What was their story? I told him about the Syrian family I'd been following. Parents who had fled their country with their 3 young children, carrying nothing but a small suitcase of family photographs. They'd lost everything but were rebuilding their lives in London with remarkable resilience and grace. "The father reminded me of you, actually," I said without thinking, then immediately worried I'd overstepped. But Dad leaned forward, curious. "How so?" "The way he talked about his children. He'd made so many sacrifices to keep them safe, left behind his career, his home, everyone he knew. And he was so proud of them, but also terrified that his choices had somehow damaged them. He kept apologizing for not being able to give them the life he'd planned." Dad was quiet for a long moment. "Did you tell him that sometimes the hardest choices parents make are the ones that look wrong from the outside?" "I did, actually. I told him that his children would grow up understanding that love sometimes looks like sacrifice, even when it's painful." "And what did he say?" I smiled at the memory. "He said he hoped his kids would be more direct about love than he'd been, that they'd learn to say the important things out loud instead of hoping their actions would be enough." Dad nodded slowly. "Smart man. I wish I'd learned that lesson 30 years ago." The conversation stayed with me long after visiting hours ended. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I found myself thinking about the parallels between my father's story and the refugee fathers. Both men had made choices they believed would protect their children, even when those choices caused pain. Both had carried enormous guilt about the unintended consequences of their decisions. But there was a crucial difference. The refugee father was actively working to ensure his children knew they were loved, while my father had spent decades hiding his love away. The next morning, I brought Dad a copy of the newspaper with my refugee family story. He read it carefully, taking his time with each paragraph. "This is beautiful writing," he said when he finished. "You really captured their dignity, and you're right, I do see myself in that father. But Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you." I braced myself, wondering what new revelation was coming. Reading this story made me realize that I've been so focused on making amends for the past that I haven't been fully present for who you are now. You're not just my daughter who I hurt. You're also this incredibly talented journalist who's building an amazing career. I want to know more about that part of your life. For the next hour, he asked detailed questions about my work that went far beyond polite parental interest. He wanted to understand the craft of journalism, the challenges of international reporting, the stories that excited me most. He listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely invested in understanding my world. When visiting hours ended, he squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of the woman you've become," he said. "Not just despite everything that happened between us, but because of your strength in surviving it and choosing to rebuild with me anyway." Walking out of the hospital that evening, I realized that Dad's heart attack had given us something unexpected, proof that our healed relationship could withstand crisis. We'd faced the possibility of loss together, supported each other through fear and uncertainty, and emerged even closer. The scared, secretive man who had thrown my gifts into the fire was gone, replaced by someone brave enough to love me openly, even from a hospital bed. And I was no longer the daughter desperate for scraps of affection, but a woman secure enough in his love to build a life that made both of us proud. 2 weeks later, when I returned to London, Dad called me just to hear about my day. It was a simple conversation about work deadlines and London weather, but it represented everything we'd fought to create, a relationship built on genuine interest, mutual respect, and love expressed without fear. For the first time in both our lives, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my London flat, video calling my family for what had become our weekly tradition. Dad had fully recovered from his heart attack and looked healthier than he had in years. Mom was showing off the new curtains she'd sewn for the living room, and Marcus was bouncing his 3-month-old daughter on his knee. "She has your eyes, Rebecca," Dad said, leaning closer to the camera to get a better look at baby Emma. Same. Intelligent expression you had as a baby. The comment was casual, natural, the kind of observation any grandfather might make about his granddaughter. But for me, it represented something profound. Dad was now comfortable claiming positive similarities between us instead of fearing them. Speaking of babies, Mom interjected with a knowing smile, we have something to tell you. I raised an eyebrow. Please don't tell me you're pregnant, Mom. I'm not sure I'm ready for a sibling at 32. Everyone laughed, and Dad shook his head. Nothing like that, but we do have news. We've decided to sell the house. This caught me off guard. The Denver house had been their home for over 30 years, filled with memories both painful and precious. We want to travel, Mom explained. Your father's heart attack made us realize we've been putting off too many dreams. We want to see the world while we're still healthy enough to enjoy it. And, Dad added, looking directly at the camera, we want to visit you properly. Not just emergency visits when I'm in the hospital, but real trips where we can explore London together. Maybe you could show us some of those coffee shops I've been reading about. The invitation was everything I'd never known I wanted. Parents who were excited to be part of my life, who wanted to see my world through my eyes instead of fearing it might take me away from them. I'd love that, I said, meaning it completely. But where will you live if you sell the house? We're looking at a smaller place closer to Marcus and Sarah, Mom said. Something with a guest room for when you visit. And Robert has a special request about that guest room. Dad cleared his throat, suddenly looking shy. I'd like it to be yellow. You mentioned once that yellow made you feel happy. And I want you to feel happy when you stay with us. The gesture was small, but significant, choosing a paint color based on my preferences instead of his own. After decades of emotional distance, he was now actively creating spaces designed to welcome me. Yellow sounds perfect, I said, touched by his thoughtfulness. As we continued talking, baby Emma began fussing in Marcus's arms. Without thinking, Dad immediately switched into grandfather mode. She might be hungry, he suggested gently. Or maybe she needs a diaper change? Here, let me... He reached toward the screen as if he could actually help, then laughed at himself. Old habits. I keep forgetting you're all the way in London. Watching him with Emma was like seeing a completely different person from the father I'd grown up with. He was patient, attentive, and completely unafraid of the vulnerability that comes with loving a child. It was the kind of grandfather I'd always hoped he might become, but never dared expect. Dad? I said impulsively. I have something to tell you too. All eyes turned to me through the video call. I took a deep breath, preparing to share news I'd been holding on to for weeks. I've been offered a position back in the States. The Tribune wants me to head up their new investigative unit in Washington, D.C. It would mean leaving London. The silence stretched for several seconds. A year ago, I would have interpreted that silence as disapproval or concern about my choices. Now I recognized it as my family processing information and choosing their words carefully. That sounds like an incredible opportunity, Dad said finally. How do you feel about it? Torn, I admitted. I love London and I've built a good life here, but the DC job would be a huge step forward professionally. And, I paused, not sure how to articulate what I was really feeling. And, Mom prompted. Gently. And I miss being closer to all of you. Not just for emergencies, but for regular life. I want to be the kind of aunt who shows up for Emma's first steps and first words. I want to help you pick out paint colors for the new house. I want Sunday dinners and random phone calls and all the normal family stuff I never thought I cared about. Dad's eyes grew bright with tears, the kind of emotional response that would have terrified him 18 months ago, but now seemed as natural as breathing. We want that too, he said softly, but only if it's what you really want. Not because You feel obligated or guilty about the past. This was the crucial difference in our new relationship. Dad was actively encouraging me to make choices based on my own desires rather than trying to influence my decisions through fear or manipulation. "It is what I want," I said with growing certainty. "London taught me that I can build a life anywhere. But I want to build the next chapter closer to home." The conversation that followed was everything I'd never experienced with my family before. Collaborative, supportive, and genuinely focused on what would make me happiest. Dad offered practical advice about DC neighborhoods. Mom started planning how we could transport some of my London belongings back to the States. And Marcus joked about finally having his sister close enough to babysit regularly. After we ended the call, I sat in my London kitchen thinking about the profound transformation our family had undergone. We'd gone from a collection of people who shared DNA but struggled to connect emotionally, to a group who actively chose to prioritize each other's happiness and well-being. The next morning, I called my editor at the Tribune and accepted the Washington position. 3 months later, I was back in the United States, unpacking boxes in my new DC apartment when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Dad standing there with a potted plant. In his hands, a small daffodil bush covered in bright yellow blooms. "Housewarming gift," he said with a smile. "I know you mentioned loving daffodils, and I thought maybe you'd like to have something living in your new space." The moment was perfect in its ordinariness. A father bringing his daughter a plant for her new apartment, a simple gesture of love and support. But for us, it represented the completion of a journey that had begun with rejected gifts and hidden treasures and evolved into this authentic, uncomplicated love expressed freely. "They're beautiful," I said, accepting the gift without hesitation or fear. "Come in, I'll make coffee and you can help me figure out the best spot for them." As we stood in my new living room, discussing window light and watering schedules, I marveled at how far we'd come. The man who once threw my carefully chosen presents into the fire was now bringing me flowers for my new home. The daughter who had given up on gift-giving was now planning what to get him for Father's Day. But more than that, we were just two people who loved each other, figuring out how to express that love in healthy, sustainable ways. We were finally free from the fear that had governed our relationship for so long. His fear of being like his father, my fear of not being worthy of love. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" Dad said as he helped me arrange the yard. "Daffodils on my windowsill. What's that?" "That Christmas morning when I almost threw your journal into the fire. I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd actually gone through with it. If I'd never told you the truth," I considered this, "I probably would have given up on you completely, and you would have kept torturing yourself in that secret room. And now?" I looked around my new apartment, the first home I'd ever created, with the confident knowledge that I was loved and supported by my family. The daffodils caught the afternoon light, casting cheerful shadows on the wall. Now we get to find out what we can build together instead of what we can survive apart. Dad smiled and pulled me into one of his hugs, the kind I'd learned to trust over the past year. Warm and genuine and free from fear. "I like that plan," he said simply. As I walked him to the door later that evening, he paused on my doorstep and turned back. "Rebecca? Thank you." "For what?" "For giving me the chance to learn how to love you properly. For not giving up on us even when it would have been easier. For showing me that it's never too late to choose love over fear." After he left, I sat with the daffodils in my lap, thinking about the strange, winding path that had brought us to this moment. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the most devastating revelations. Sometimes the deepest love grows from the ashes of the deepest pain. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a second chance to build the relationship you always needed with the parent who always loved you, even when neither of you knew how to show it. The daffodils bloomed in my window all spring, a daily reminder that some gifts are worth waiting 30 years to give and receive properly. Into the end, that turned out to be the most valuable lesson my father ever taught me. That love, real love, is patient enough to wait for the right moment to emerge from hiding, and brave enough to keep growing, even after it's been buried for decades. The fire that once consumed my gifts had become the warmth that finally brought us home to each other. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.